deal with chapter 4 then. Okay, and chapter 4 is one of those chapters. It's kind of like the book throws it in to like cleanse your palate. It's kind of like just more conceptual than mathematical, but it's still important. So it's called data collection and sampling. And let's go back to what we started this class with. We said statistics is a way to get information from data, right? So we started with data. And we said we're going to learn statistics, and we've learned a whole bunch of statistics so far, so we can take data and get information. But where does the data come from? Where does our data come from? Where does the data come from? The data you've been working with, where does it come from? Well, you go to book Excel files and it's there, right? But in the real world, in the business world, where does the data come from? Jonathan, where does the data come from? You had a smirk and you made eye contact with me, so I'm sorry.
Maybe people you're working with.
Okay, what do you mean by people you're working with?
Your clients.
You think there's a guy that he's the data guy? We get data from John. No. What do you think?
Maybe your clients or your competition.
Okay, so there's all kinds of data. There's published data, like the U.S. government puts out all kind of published data, like census data. There are industry sources of data. When you're doing transactions, that's data. When you guys enroll in a class, think about that's data creation. But another type of data is we can get data. Well, let's talk about this. So there are many methods used to gather data. First one is direct observation. So that direct observation means we just kind of observe what's happening. For example, in this class, I would like to know the number of people wearing red. And maybe I go into every class and figure that out. That's direct observation. The number of people that didn't have an umbrella today on the mall. That's direct observation. Direct observation is transactional data. Now, experimentation is a little bit different. What is the difference between direct observation and experimentation? What is it, experimentation? We can gather data through an experiment. How can we do that? How?
You create a theory or a hypothesis, and then you set up some kind of experiment or some method of testing.
Okay, so give me an example. Like what's the deal with the experiment? So we set up an experiment to test that hypothesis. And what we try to do is we try to control for things, right? We say, if Dr. Miko wears a sweater vest, do students pay attention better, right? And that might be our experiment. So maybe in one class I wear a sweater vest, in the next class I don't wear a sweater vest, right? That's our control group and our experimental group. If you think about it like when they test a new drug, how do they test new drugs? You guys know how they test new drugs? They call them clinical trials. Those are good experiments. How do they test a new drug? Anyone know? Huh? Mr. Boyd, you talking? No. Someone back there. So. Come on. How do they test a new drug? Randall, go ahead.
Like groupings of, give a certain amount to this group or, affiliation.
Okay, so sometimes, what's a placebo? Do you guys know what a placebo is? What's a placebo? Rachel?
It's kind of like something that they did to make people think they're actually doing the real thing.
Yeah.
It's not.
Right. So you sometimes just by people focusing on you or you thinking you're part of something, our mind's a crazy thing, and you say, "Oh, I feel better," right? Or whatever it might be. So they need a control for that, right? Because they need to control that. So they have what's called a control group and an experimental group, and the experimental group gets the drug, and the control group, they don't know it, but they're getting like a fake pill, right? And then we compare the differences between the two. We're trying to compare for what they call, it's something called the Hawthorne Effect. Do you know what the Hawthorne Effect is? Maybe you studied in Management 101. Like people do better when they're being observed. You know what I'm saying? Like if I came in here and observed you, you're gonna work harder. Okay, that's called the Hawthorne Effect. So an experiment is a way to gather data when we control for something. And the last one is something that we see all the time, and that's called surveying, right? So if you are in marketing, you're doing marketing research, I'm sure you're putting together surveys for your clients. And a survey is a way to gather data from maybe something we don't have published. We put together a survey and we try to get that information. And there's different types of surveys. There's a personal interview. So if I sit down with you and say, what do you think of the course so far? That is kind of a survey. And I sit down with each one of you and say, what do you think of the course? That's a survey. What's the issue with a personal interview? What's the issue with a personal interview? Yes?
Kind of influenced in the way you answer.
Okay, and also, what else? It takes a lot of my time, right? And time is money. So personal interview allows us to gather rich data because I can do follow-ups, but it's very time intensive. What's the problem with a telephone interview? What's the problem with a telephone survey? It's kind of like a personal interview, but what happens with a telephone survey? What's that? You can't see the other person, but how many people have got a telephone survey and hung right up? You ever have that happen? So when we do that, we get what we call response rate issues. A response rate is, let's say we try to sample 1,000, but only 100 participated in our survey. That means our response rate is 10%. When you do a phone survey, it's typically less than 5%. If you do a mail survey, it's going to be less than 1%. Now, we do surveys like at the end of this class, and the response rate, the idea survey, you guys know what I'm talking about, idea survey, you guys do that survey on how was the professor, how was the course. The response rate on that is very high because I have you captured here, and I'm like, do this, right? So it's very high. And that is known as a self-administered questionnaire, right? So I don't have to spend time, you spend the time. That's a self-administered questionnaire. We see this all the time in the business world. When you receive a survey, online survey, or a mail survey, those are called self-administered questionnaires. A good example of this is if you ever eaten at a restaurant and they ask you to fill out a response card after you're done, like Hawthorne does that, right? What's the problem with that data that you gather from those surveys? What's the problem with those response cards you get from a survey, like a restaurant survey? What do you think? Who fills out those cards? Okay, well, they don't make you do it at Hawthorne, so who does it? Typically, it's people that had really a really good experience or people that had a really bad experience, right? So is that survey representative of most of our customers? Probably not, right? Probably mostly older people fill it out. When the Miko family goes in there with 5 damn kids, you bet your ass, I'm just happy to get out of there, right? I'm not taking time to fill out a response card. So they're missing this, right? They're missing my opinion of how the service was. So we're not going to design any questionnaires, but a couple things to keep in mind when you design questionnaires. Keep it simple, keep it straightforward, and when possible, use closed-ended questions. What I mean by closed-ended questions are questions that aren't like, how are you feeling today? What would be a better, and you might say, I'm a little down, Dr. Miko, I'm not crazy about this weather, I'm melancholy, or I'm depressed, I'm happy. Those are all good, right? They're all rich data, but if I want to analyze it, what's wrong with that data? A lot. So how could I make it a closed-ended question?
You could say, like, how was your experience with
Right. I could say, a lot of times we do like statements of agreement, like I enjoyed this meal. And 5 means strongly agree, 4 means agree, 3's neither, 2's disagree, 1 strong. Have you seen those Likert scales, whatever you want to call them? I've enjoyed this professor. I've enjoyed this course. Those are closed-ended questions, and those are better because I can statistically analyze those. Those are better for our purposes, right? For us to get data. Now, they're not as rich, but we can analyze them better because then it's nominal data or ordinal data that we can organize. Okay. So if we're going to go out and get data, we have to do something called a sample. Remember we talked about sample statistics. We make inferences about population parameters. Well, how do I do a sample? How do I determine who's part of my sample? Give me an example of this. How do I determine who's part of my sample? All right, put your laptops down. If you're not going to participate, then you're going to have to do. Kyle?
You want to see who's your target population?
Okay, who your target population, but how would I go about getting a sample? Let's say, for example, I wanted to know how much St. Francis University students spent on books, right? And I don't want to talk to every damn St. Francis University student. So how could I get an estimate for that data without talking to every St. Francis University student? What would I do? Eric, what would I do?
choose, like, I don't know, choose
a couple hundred students, send them an email or something, say, please respond to this.
Okay, choose a couple hundred students. He says we need a sample, right? That's right. How do we choose those couple hundred students? Because that's what's called a sampling plan. How would you choose those couple hundred students?
I don't know, you just choose at random.
Okay, very good. So the first sampling plan we're going to study is called a simple random sample, meaning if we had all 2,000 names of St. Francis University students and we randomly selected 100, that is called a simple random sample. And it's one of the best ways to do a random sample, right? It's one of the best ways to do a sample because there's no bias built in, right? There's no bias built in. If I said, I'm going to sample you guys, or I'm going to sample people in Schwab Hall, what happens there? I'm going to say, I'm going to sample 100 customers and 100 students in Schwab Hall about how much they spend on the textbook. What happens there? Yes.
There's a lot of materials in the about the same amount.
Okay, very good. That means what's happening there is our sample population doesn't look like our target population, right? Because they're mostly business students. If I go to Christian Hall, which is called a cluster sample, I go to one place and do a sample. Like if I go to Christian Hall and I sample them, well, there's business students living there, there's PA students living there, OT, science students. But if I do a cluster sample, if I go to Christian Hall and do a sample, what's the issue with that sample? Yeah, it's mostly, there's no freshmen in there, right? There are not a lot in there. So it's all upperclassmen, and it doesn't represent the freshman experience. So this is a big thing. When I design a sampling plan, I want to make sure my sample population looks a lot like my target population. That's the only way it can truly represent the target population. So ways we get there. The best way is something called the simple random sample, right? The simple random sample is everyone has an equal likelihood of being chosen to be part of the sample. Put everyone's name on a ping pong ball, get a big vat, shake it up, pull out 100 ping pong balls, right? Sometimes they used to use the phone book for this, right? They used to say, I'm going to sample 100 names randomly from the phone book. What's wrong with that method? What's wrong with that method? I go down every 10th name in the phone book or every 100th name in the phone book. What's that? Phone book's huge, takes a lot of time, but we got time. What's the problem with the phone book, though? Yes? Not everyone's going to answer, so that's a problem with telephone survey. Yes?
Some of the numbers can be disconnected.
Sure, some of the numbers can be just, all those are problems. What's the problem with using the telephone book as our sample, though? Are you in the telephone book? Not everyone has a phone, right? A lot of people now don't have a phone, right? So that is underrepresenting like your generation, right? Because most of the people that are in the phone book now are older generations, right? So that's a problem. That's a problem. That's an issue. So simple random sample is the easiest. We can generate random numbers in Excel. It's pretty easy. There's a function to do it. We're not going to do that until later in this class. We can also do something called a stratified random sample. A stratified random sample is a random sample, but we make sure we get enough in every category, right? So we're going to randomly sample, but we're going to make sure we get 50 males and 50 females. Maybe we make sure we get 100 Republicans and 100 Democrats. Because in a stratified random sample, not only can I say something about the whole population, but then I can also say something about my strata. Strata are categories, right? I can compare the males and females. I can compare the Republicans and Democrats. I can compare the people under 30 to the people over 30. Does this make sense? So that's called a stratified random sample. And finally, the last one is something called a cluster sample. And I've talked about that. A cluster sample is a form of a convenience sample where I go to one place. If I went to Christian Hall, that's a cluster sample. If I use this, cluster samples are not necessarily, they're convenient for me, right? Because they're a cluster, I can gather that cluster at one point, but they're inherent with what we call sampling bias, okay? They have sampling bias in them. So, why do we study this, okay? Why do we study this? Well, there are errors that we want to avoid. You can do the greatest statistics in the world, but if there's a problem by the way you took your sample, it doesn't matter how nice your graphs look and how good your numbers are, because if someone points to you and says, you know what, there's a problem in your sampling plan, this doesn't represent the general population, then your numbers are no good anyway. So we want to talk about forms of errors, okay? Forms of errors. And this is probably the most important concept from this chapter. There are two categories of errors, two broad categories of errors. The first one is sampling error. And sampling error is pretty easy. Sampling error is error that arises just because we took a sample. Just because we didn't talk to every man, woman, and child at St. Francis University, we're going to be off a little bit. Okay? We're going to be off because I only talked to 30 people and not 500 people. Now, sampling error we can control for. How do we reduce sampling error? How do you think we make sampling error less? How do you think we reduce the error of sampling? What do you think we can do to reduce the error of sampling? It says in the bottom there. Sample more people. If I said, how much did you spend on your book, Randall and Roger? You know, they give me an answer and I average it together. It probably could be way off. Maybe both of them spent very little. But if I start sampling more and more people, I'm going to get people spend a lot of money, people spend a little money, and I'm going to get a lot of people that are right there in the middle, right? It's going to be normally shaped. So sampling error can be reduced by sampling more, okay? That's one good thing about sampling error. We can reduce it by sampling more. Now, the other category of error is something called non-sampling error, okay? Non-sampling error. So it is problems in the way we took the sample. This isn't related to how many we sampled. This is related to the process that we utilized when we took the sample. Increasing the sample size will not reduce this type of error. It'll just perpetuate it. It'll just be more of it. The first type of non-sampling error is errors in data acquisition. Okay? So, for example, if I was trying to figure out the average weight of males at St. Francis University, but my scale was off 20 pounds, doesn't matter how many I sample, that's going to be a screwed up analysis, right? So if I have incorrect measurements being taken because of faulty equipment, if when I transcribe things, the person said yes and I wrote down no, that's errors in data acquisition. If I'm asking you something and you don't understand what I'm asking you, if you don't understand the question, you might not give me a good answer because you don't understand the question. That's errors in data acquisition. And finally, if I ask you something personal, you know, even if it's anonymous, you may lie, right? You may lie about it. Like a lot of times there's surveys that, you know, they're about personal things and people fool themselves and they lie about it. So inaccurate responses due to questions concerning sensitive issues. All these are what we call errors in data acquisition. They're a problem with the process. Sampling more does not reduce this type of error. The second type of non-sampling error is non-response error. Okay? Non-response error is when there's people that cannot be included in the sample because of the way we did the sample. Okay? If we do a telephone interview, okay, people without telephones are automatically excluded. If we go to Torvian and do a sample there, people that don't need a Torvian, students that don't need a Torvian ever, are automatically excluded. These are examples of non-response error, which are introduced when responses are not obtained from some members of the sample. Cluster samples. If I go to St. Louis Hall and do a sample, it's all males in St. Louis Hall still, right? I'm missing all the women, right? So it's underrepresented. So that's called non-response error. When people can't be part of that, the members of the population can't be part of that sample. And the last one is probably, kind of the most egregious and the most common one, and that is selection bias. So selection bias is doing a sample in such a way that, and it's kind of related to non-response error, that it's biased in some way. So if I go over to the gym and I say, I'm trying to get average male height, and I see 15, 20 dudes on the court, and I ask them, what's your height? And I record that, and I get an average, and it's 6'5". Well, and I say the average St. Francis University male height is 6'5". There's a problem there, right? Because I sampled just men's volleyball players. Yes, that's an issue. Have you ever seen results that says, according to I'll just pick Fox News survey? Okay, what's inherently wrong with according to a Fox News survey of its viewers? What's the problem with that? According to a Fox News survey of its viewers. Yeah, who watches Fox News, Mr. Boyd? Older generation, and what else? What kind of politically leaning people, Rachel? They're conservative folks, right? MSNBC tends to be more liberal type. Sometimes I do watch Fox News, and you're right, it's older generation, because I watch, sometimes when I'm at Decepio, it's on and I just watch it. All the commercials on Fox News are like, hover rounds, scooters, put your money in gold because, Obama's gonna ruin everything. Reverse mortgages, you know what a reverse mortgage is? It's all, lifeline stuff, it's all geared toward like an older population, because they know who's watching Fox News. They know the type of person that's watching Fox News. So this chapter, that was the end of chapter 4. Chapter 4 is just conceptual. Your homework in chapter 4 is to read chapter 4, and if you're not going to read chapter 4, then look at the study card at the end of chapter 4 and read that. Okay, it's only a page. I went through it, try to understand it. It's an important aspect of where we get data from. Questions on chapter 4? All right, you can get out your laptops. Whew, that was a tough 20 minutes to get through without a laptop, wasn't it? Okay, so what I'd like you guys to do is on Blackboard under sample exams, you guys see sample exams? There is under sample exam 2,